All right, hi everyone. I hope you're doing well. So this is lecture video 15 out of 16, so we're getting very close to the end now. In this video, we're going to have two topics. We're going to discuss functional analysis or functional assessment. You'll hear me use those terms interchangeably. And then we'll also introduce motivation just a little bit and talk a lot more about motivation in our last lecture video. So as you'll see with functional analysis, sometimes it's helpful to understand the cause of a behavior so that we can tailor our treatment plan for that specific cause. But we'll talk about the details of that coming up. Activity 12 is going to be mentioned in this lecture video, I believe. So remember that you do get 2 drop grades for activities. So let me know if you have questions about whether or not it would be beneficial for you to complete activity 12. So just let me know if you need anything. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be starting off by talking about functional assessment. So you'll hear me use the terms functional assessment or functional analysis interchangeably. They essentially mean the same thing. When we're talking about functional analysis, we're talking about determining the cause of a problem behavior. And you might ask yourself, why do we need to know the cause of a problem behavior? So based on the information we've already talked about, we know how to reinforce good behaviors regardless of why those behaviors are happening. We know how to punish bad behaviors regardless of why those behaviors are happening. So the question then is, does it matter why a problem behavior is happening? And I think a lot of the time it does. So let's have an example. If you have a student that is not turning in his homework, that's a problem behavior, and you could reinforce him when he does turn in his homework, and you could punish him when he does not turn in his homework. But there are many potential reasons why a student might not be turning in homework, and your punishment might be more effective or your reinforcement might be more effective if you knew the actual cause and could tailor your treatment plan specific to that cause. So the child may not be turning in his homework because he doesn't understand the material, because he needs extra help, because he doesn't have anyone at home to help him do his homework. It could be that the individual does not understand the instructions, or because we have attention issues or organizational issues. There could be something medical going on, or the student may be doing it because the student gets attention from you as the teacher when he doesn't turn in his homework. There are tons of reasons why a problem behavior might happen, and it does matter in a lot of cases why the behavior is happening. So to introduce the idea of functional analysis or functional assessment, we're going to start off by identifying the difference between an antecedent and a consequence. So functional analysis basically examines the relationship between a behavior and its antecedents and consequences. The antecedents come first. So to help you remember this, we can call this the ABC model. So we have an antecedent, and then a behavior, and then a consequence. Now, the antecedent that comes first is basically an eliciting stimuli. It's something that sets off that behavior or triggers that behavior. So you would try to identify what might be setting off the behavior, triggering the behavior. This is something that happens before the behavior happens. But then also after the behavior, there's typically a consequence. Now, it could be a consequence that a parent administers or that a teacher administers, or it could be involved with classmates. The consequence typically goes back to our ideas of operant conditioning. So the slide here mentions positive or negative reinforcement. It could also be positive or negative punishment. So the consequence basically gives the individual some information about whether or not that behavior worked out well for them. So we have something that causes the behavior, and then the behavior happens, and then we have a consequence that tells us whether we should do that behavior again. One interesting thing to note is that a consequence for today's behavior could be an antecedent for tomorrow's behavior. So if, for example, a student does a behavior and is reinforced for that, then the next time they're in a situation where they're maybe considering doing that behavior, they'll remember that. And so the past history of being reinforced can be something that triggers the behavior, makes it happen again. On the other hand, if a behavior has been punished, then that could be something that makes the behavior less likely to happen again. So with functional analysis, we're trying to understand the causes of problem behaviors It's going to involve a systematic manipulation of environmental events to experimentally test their role in behavior maintenance. All right, the basic idea is that you as a teacher or as a parent or whatever your relationship is to the individual, you probably have an idea about why a person is engaging in a certain problem behavior. But in order to have a really effective treatment, we need to know for sure what's causing it. And of course, hearkening back to our research lecture, the way to know something for sure is to experiment. And something is an experiment if it involves a manipulation. So we're going to manipulate the situation to test our hypothesis about the cause of problem behavior. So let me give you an example here. You're going to see this coming up very shortly. Sometimes a problem behavior happens because of attention. So the individual wants to get attention. This is not just in children, by the way. You can see adults also misbehaving because they want attention. So let's say that there is a child that is having temper tantrums, and you think that the temper tantrums are happening because the child wants attention. However, before we want to start with our treatment, we want to make sure that the child is doing it to get attention. That's where a functional analysis could come in. Now, we need to experimentally test this. So, one way to do this would be to withdraw your attention. If the individual is doing the behavior to get your attention and you withdraw that attention, they'll probably, initially the behavior will get worse because they'll think, if I'm just a little bit louder, I'll get that attention. But if you continue to ignore them, the behavior will probably stop. On the other hand, if you were to give more attention when the individual threw a temper tantrum, and then the temper tantrums would probably get worse because they are more and more reinforcing. Now you might ask yourself the question, why in the world would I ever make a problem behavior worse? Well, sometimes in the early stages here, we have to test to make sure we understand the right cause. And so the behavior might get a little bit worse during our functional analysis, but when it does, we know that we've found the right cause, and then we can come up with the right kind of treatment plan. Now, limitations here. First of all, this cannot really be done with infrequent behaviors. So we're systematically manipulating, trying to understand the cause of a behavior. If this is a behavior that the person does once a month, or even once a week, it's pretty hard then to do an experiment here with such a limited sample size. If it's something that they only do every once in a while, and you then give attention and it seems to get worse, but they're only doing it every once in a while, so it's really hard to consistently test your theory, you might not have enough information, basically, to do a functional analysis. But also, this is something we would not want to do with dangerous behaviors. Why is this something that we do not do with dangerous behaviors? We would not want to ever make a dangerous behavior worse. So, if you suspect that a child is banging his head or biting his classmates for attention, you would not want to give attention for that and then risk increasing that violent behavior just to understand why it's happening. In that particular situation, you're going to go probably straight to punishment of bad behavior, reinforcement of good behavior, because functional analysis, when you increase something, it could potentially be very dangerous. This would also be true if someone had like suicidal ideation, having thoughts about hurting themselves. This is not a situation where you want to manipulate that. So we're going to do this with behaviors that happen relatively frequently and behaviors that are not particularly dangerous to themselves or to someone else. Also, this can be expensive and time-consuming, so certainly teachers have a lot going on in the classroom as far as just following their lesson plans. So trying to do a functional analysis or a functional assessment is something that may be beyond the scope of the teacher if you're not able to do in the classroom, you just don't have enough time. But if you're considering being a school psychologist, or maybe this is something that you might do as a parent with a child, with one of your children, then that might be a good time to do that. It's expensive if you have a psychologist do it, but potentially helpful, worth it in the long run. All right, so the basic idea behind functional analysis is that we're going to manipulate the situation to try to test for potential causes of problem behaviors. So we're going to talk about several potential causes of problem behaviors we will not have a chance to touch on all of them, but I hope that going through some of the more common ones will give you enough information here to be able to do this even with different causes of problem behaviors. So first of all, it talks about social positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement, as we've already discussed, is adding something to make a behavior more likely to happen. Social positive reinforcement means that it is coming from the individual's social environment. So when we're talking about social positive reinforcement, we're essentially talking about attention. Now, there is nothing wrong with giving attention to children or to other people. You should pay attention to the people in your lives. Children need and deserve attention, but we have to be cautious here because sometimes we give attention for behaviors that we do not want to reinforce, we do not intend to reinforce, but sometimes we do this accidentally. Sometimes this is done by other people, so a well-meaning grandparent could definitely do this, or classmates. Even if you as the teacher are not giving attention for bad behavior, a student might be getting attention from classmates for bad behavior. So what are some clues that the individual is doing the behavior to get attention? Well, first of all, is the person getting attention for the behavior? Because if they're not getting attention for the behavior, then they'll probably, if they're really wanting attention, they'll mix it up, they'll do something different until they do get attention. So if they're not getting attention for the behavior, this is probably not the cause. But assuming that they are getting attention from someone, which is not necessarily you, but someone, you'll also notice that the person approaches the attention giver prior to behavior and maybe seems to be in a good mood. If you're doing something to get attention, you will never do it when you're by yourself, right? Think about that. The child or the individual, whoever it may be, will not have the problem behavior when he or she is alone, and will probably not have the problem behavior in front of people whose attention they don't want or whose attention they're not going to get. So if teacher never pays attention when they do the behavior, then they're probably not going to do the behavior in front of the teacher. Instead, they're going to go find someone who will pay them attention. So like I said, this could be a family member, this could be peers, whatever the case may be. And the individual seems to be happy, everything is good. It seems like the behavior comes out of the blue. It's not like we were already angry, or we were hungry, or we were tired. Everything was totally fine, and then the problem behavior happened. Well, it may be because the individual is doing it to get attention. Now, if you systematically test this by removing attention to see what happens, adding attention to see what happens, and you feel confident that attention is the issue, here's what you should do. Give attention when the individual is behaving appropriately. I'm not suggesting that you ignore children all the time. That's not healthy. That's not good. Children need attention. Your friends and family members need attention too. But give them attention when they are behaving appropriately. And then, when they engage in the problem behavior, ignore them. Now, remember what I said about we don't do this with dangerous behaviors. So I'm not telling you to ignore a child hurting another child, or ignore your roommate who is threatening to hurt themselves. That's not what I'm saying. We do not do this with dangerous behaviors. But if a child is being rude, or throwing a temper tantrum, or whatever the case may be, by ignoring that child, you're communicating to them that that behavior is no longer going to get them what they want. Now, as I said, you may see a brief increase in the behavior because they think if I turn it up a notch, I'll get the attention. But if you're consistent here, basically what we're doing is extinguishing the behavior. We're using extinction. We're going to stop reinforcing a problem behavior, and eventually the problem behavior will probably stop. All right? But there's another type of positive reinforcement that you might have to look out for, internal sensory positive reinforcement. Now, just as this sounds, this is a situation where the individual is doing a behavior because it feels good. Now, this may not make sense to you if it's something that doesn't feel good to you, but might be something that feels good to the person. So, for example, for some children, aggression feels good. hurting other people feels good. We may not understand exactly why that is, but that's the case. It could be for some individuals engaging in self-injurious behaviors or things that they do to hurt themselves feels good. There's some kind of relief there. So this could be a person cutting or skin picking, hair pulling, head banging, any number of things here. The person is doing the behavior because it feels good for them. Now, how do we know that this is the cause? Well, paying attention here, especially to the setting in which it happens. If an individual is doing a behavior because they're getting attention for it, they'll only do it in public or only in front of that person whose attention they want. If they're doing it because it feels good, they'll continue to do it probably regardless of where they are, as long as it feels good. So whether they're alone or whether they're in a public setting, they'll probably continue to do it at a steady rate, regardless of whether you pay attention to them or not. Now, this is a tricky situation because, well, for several reasons. One is because sometimes this is a borderline of a dangerous situation. So sometimes the individual is doing something that feels good to them and it's just inappropriate or something like that. But sometimes they're doing something where they could potentially hurt themselves. If we're talking about a person head banging or cutting, this is something that could get out of hand quickly and be potentially dangerous. So in that kind of situation, you certainly would not want to try to manipulate it much, make it feel better. Instead, the treatment is to try to, first of all, make the target behavior not feel as good, and then second of all, help them find a good feeling from alternative behaviors. So, for example, if we have an individual that feels good, aggression just feels good for that person, although we would like to try to address any emotional, psychological, cognitive issues that might be associated with that, there are some socially appropriate ways to engage in that behavior, like, for example, contact sports. We can play football, or we can box, or something like that. There may be a situation where we're able to find the person an appropriate outlet for that. But of course you want to keep an eye on that and make sure that it does not get worse and become a dangerous behavior. Alright, so that was a couple of types of positive reinforcement. What about negative reinforcement? Remember that negative reinforcement means we're doing something to increase a behavior by taking away something that is unwanted. And the social aspect here says that this is being administered by other people. So basically we're talking about escapes from demands. This is a situation where the individual is engaging in a problem behavior to try to get out of something. Basically, the negative reinforcement, they are not going to have to do their chores because of this problem behavior, or they're not going to have to do their homework, or they're not going to have to eat their broccoli, whatever, because of this negative behavior. Now, one thing to say is that this could take several different forms. The behavior that the person engages in, the cause maybe at its core is the same. They're doing it to get out of something, but this could be a person who on the one hand is very aggressive and violent and loud and obnoxious to try to get out of something. Or it could be a person that endears themselves to you, they suck up to you to try to get out of something. Or it could be even, this is not an abnormal psychology class, so we won't talk about somatic disorders, but it could be a person that has bouts of sickness, whether those be actually felt or self-induced or whatever, or faked. A person may have, I'm sick so I can't do this, that kind of thing. Any of these things could potentially be done to try to avoid an unpleasant situation. This could be that they don't want to have to do something, or they don't want to be around certain people, whatever the case may be. Now, if this is the situation that we really are just trying to get out of a demand, then the problem behavior will happen only when certain types of requests are made, and as soon as the person says, okay, fine, you don't have to do it, the problem behavior will probably stop. So, for example, a child is asked to eat their dinner, and the child throws a temper tantrum. until the parent says, fine, you don't have to eat your dinner. Now, what has happened is that we have reinforced the temper tantrum behavior by removing something that the person did not want. Now, what's going to happen the next time we try to get the child to eat their dinner or to comply with something else, we're going to see the same thing. This may be a student that is sick and needs to go to see the nurse every time you have a test, or they get called on in class, or that kind of thing. There's any number of ways that this could appear. So what you're going to see is that the person will continue the problem behavior until the demand is taken away. So how are we going to treat this? Well, first of all, we need to persist until the person complies. So if parent tells child to eat their dinner, child throws a temper tantrum, parent needs to say, no, the temper tantrum is not going to get you out of dinner. Now, you can use punishment here if you want to, and put the child in timeout, but as soon as timeout is over, we're back to the table eating our supper, because if the individual gets to go to timeout and then doesn't have to eat their supper, then they've gotten what they wanted, right? So persist. And one thing you can do here, it talks about teaching other responses, is reinforcing them for eating their food. So a child's throwing a temper tantrum because they don't want to eat their food. It is okay to punish them for not eating their food. It is okay to reinforce them for eating their food, or to combine those together. Another thing to keep in mind is that we might start off with a small request and then gradually increase the difficulty of the request and combine that with reinforcement. So telling a child to go clean their entire room may actually be more than the child can manage, or maybe just a little bit too difficult at that point in time. But if we tell the child, pick up your dirty clothes and put them in the laundry basket, and then we reinforce that, give them some praise, good job, thank you, then next time they might be able to do something a little bit bigger as well. So you can start off with easier tasks and then gradually get to more complicated tasks. But what you don't want to do is to reinforce this behavior by letting them escape from the situation that they don't want to be in. All right? What about an elicited situation? It says some behavior is elicited rather than controlled by consequences. So what we're saying here is that it's not about getting a reinforcement or avoiding a punishment. That's not what we're doing. Our behavior is caused by the situation. So in this particular kind of issue, the individual will engage in the problem behavior only in certain situations, or only when certain stimuli are there, and the behavior seems involuntary. So let me give you some examples. If a child only has a problem behavior when a certain adult is present, then it may be that there's something about that adult that is potentially causing the child distress. So maybe this is an abusive situation or a neglectful situation, or just something about that adult that causes anxiety in the child. So this is not a situation where the child is trying to get something good or avoid something bad. Being in the presence of that person causes them to behave in a certain way. Another example here could be test anxiety. So it's not that they're trying to get something or that they're trying to avoid something. It's that the anxiety that they feel physically and psychologically on test day causes problem behavior. So you can imagine a child who is experiencing extreme anxiety could have a wide range of problem behaviors. But when you have something like anxiety, punishing someone for being anxious is not really effective. Reinforcing someone for not being anxious might be slightly more effective, but think about this. The person who is anxious doesn't want to be anxious. They're not choosing to be anxious. Nobody would choose to feel anxious, right? So in that particular situation, instead of trying to change the reinforcement and the punishment, we need to try to fix the underlying problem. So like, for example, if it's a test anxiety situation, there's something about the situation causing the student to misbehave, and it's anxiety that they feel. Instead of reinforcing them for not having that behavior or punishing them for having that behavior, we need to teach them how to deal with their anxiety. It talks about PMR here. This is progressive muscle relaxation. You don't really need to know the details of this beyond the scope of this class, but basically it's about tightening and loosening various muscle groups in a particular order, and it's good for calming down a person. Deep breathing would be another thing that you could do here. Usually when you're working with kids, a more behavioral treatment is more effective than something you might do more of a cognitive treatment with an adult, but usually doesn't work for young children. But if there's a problem in the situation, the child may not be able to control their behavior. The behavior may seem involuntary. So beyond just using punishment and reinforcement, you need to get to the heart of what is specifically causing the problem. And one other thing to consider that might be causing the problem is that the individual might have a medical issue. So a medical issue, the problem emerges suddenly and does not seem to be related to any changes in the individual's environment. So when you start seeing a problem behavior out of a child or an adult, an individual who usually does not have that problem behavior, one of the first things you might wonder is, has there been a change in the environment? Is this person under a lot of stress? Is there some problems at home? Is there something financial going on, or relationships? But if there doesn't seem to be any change in the person's environment, and yet the problems kind of come out of the blue, it could be potentially a medical problem. And this medical problem could be because the person has an illness, or it could be because of a medication that they're taking that might have some side effects that are causing the problem behaviors. So, for example, a student might be falling asleep at their desk. Or we might think about a student that has a difficult time staying in their desk if we're talking about maybe an ADHD situation here. So let's think about a student who has ADHD. Of course, reinforcing staying in your desk is good. And the question is, should we punish a student for not paying attention if that student is not capable of paying attention? That's not going to be effective, really. If we have a student who's having maybe a sleep disorder, maybe having nightmare issues, insomnia issues, or maybe just tired because of a medication that the child is taking, really, is punishing the child for falling asleep in class going to solve the problem? Not at all. What we need to do is have that individual see a doctor. So the therapist will take into account antecedents and consequences of the behavior, medical and nutritional variables. One thing that will break your heart is that sometimes students are having problem behaviors because they're hungry, because they haven't had enough to eat, or because they don't have what they need at home. So taking all those things into account, you're going to develop a treatment plan based on a diagnosis. That medical diagnosis should come from a physician. So you might need to contact a parent here and let them know what's going on. It's probably a good idea, and see if you can have that child seen by a doctor, and then consult with the doctor about what kinds of treatments might be effective. Alright, so some general guidelines here. We have to define the problem behavior, and we need to be specific about it because we can't measure something if we don't know exactly what we're talking about. So define the problem behavior and then try to identify any antecedents or triggers, things that come before the behavior, seem to set off the behavior, as well as any consequences, what happens after the behavior happens. Consider health, medical, personal variables. When it comes to personal variables, I mean, maybe we have parents that are fighting or splitting up, or maybe we have a sickness in the family. Maybe the child is not sick, but a family member is sick, that kind of thing. So taking all of that into account, you should form a hypothesis. You might say, I think this is happening to get attention or to escape from demands. Once you have a hypothesis, then you're going to collect data, if possible by doing a functional analysis, where you would, for example, increase attention, decrease attention, and see how that impacts the behavior. If, for example, attention is your hypothesis. Once you have some information, you can design your treatment program and test it. If that treatment seems to be effective, then you probably picked the right cause. If that treatment does not seem to be effective, then you might have picked the wrong cause. You need to go back and reconsider. Alright. Now, as I said in one of my previous videos, I have a hard time sometimes showing video clips when I post YouTube videos. YouTube doesn't always like me to have YouTube videos inside my YouTube videos. It's like I'm creating some kind of wormhole here. But I have a clip here. The basic idea, I don't know if you guys ever watched Toddlers and Tiaras. That show has not been on for quite some time as far as I'm aware. However, there is a wealth of psychopathology on TLC if you're interested. I used to watch a lot of TLC back when I had cable. Very interesting. So you can find any number of clips of toddlers and tiaras throwing temper tantrums. So you might ask yourself the question, all right, obviously the problem behavior is we're throwing temper tantrums, and these little divas will scream and hit and threaten and any other number of problem behaviors. So once you identify the problem behavior, you have to start asking yourself questions about what has caused this behavior. Of course, it's much easier to do this if you're actually involved in the situation. Harder to do this if you're watching a television show. But I choose Toddlers and Tiaras as an example because I think it's pretty clear what's going on here. We sent a television crew to record the individual throwing temper tantrums. And that's why people watch these shows, is for the drama, right? If they were all well behaved, then it wouldn't be as entertaining. So I find it very likely that in a lot of these situations, they are engaging in these problem behaviors to get attention. So if that's the cause, then we need to give attention at appropriate times and remove attention when the problem behavior happens. So if I were a mother on that show, then I would have to say, no, we're not going to be on this show anymore, because the attention that you get from parent, people around, the television crew, as well as, you know, whoever is watching Toddlers and Tiaras, that's a lot of attention for bad behavior. So just something to keep in mind. Alright, as I said during today's video, we are also going to start talking about motivation, and then we will finish up motivation during the last lecture video. So this last section of the class has focused on behavior, and of course motivation is closely related to behavior. Motivation is something that drives your behavior. So today we're going to mostly be talking about a definition of motivation and then different perspectives on motivation. There are many that we just don't have time to touch on all of them, but we will talk about some of the most common ones. Alright, so motivation involves the processes that energize, direct, and sustain behavior. So everything we do, we have some kind of motivation for. Now, it certainly is possible that you might find yourself in a situation where you're not sure what motivated that behavior. You engaged in a behavior, and then looking back on it, you're thinking, why did I do that? I don't know why I did that. We all have those moments. But think about what your life would be like if you did not have motivation. And one thing to note is that a lack of motivation, that would be a symptom of some different psychological issues. For example, depression sometimes involves a lack of motivation. People no longer feel a drive to do anything. There are other disorders in which that can be involved as well. So you were motivated to get out of bed this morning. You were motivated to take this class. You're motivated to do your homework. You're motivated to read a textbook. Everything that you do happens because of some kind of motivation. Now, it could be that there are several different people engaging in the same behavior, and they're all doing it for different reasons. And you might ask yourself, does it matter why we do what we do? And I think it does, and we'll get there in just a second. Alright, when it talks about perspectives on motivation, there are several different ways to think about why people do what they do. A behavioral perspective would emphasize external rewards and punishments. So this is what we've been talking about in the last section of the class. This is the idea that your behavior is motivated by consequences. When you engage in behaviors that are reinforced, you are more motivated to engage in those again. When you engage in behaviors that are punished, you are less likely to want to do those behaviors again. So the behavioral perspective would say that your motivation comes largely from outside of you, from your environment. It would come more from your parents. It would come more from your teachers, more from your peers, from society in general perhaps, but that your behavior is happening because of external reasons. All right. Then the humanistic perspective, you may have heard of Maslow or Carl Rogers or other humanistic psychologists. The basic idea behind humanism or the humanistic perspective is that individuals are inherently good and that we have a potential and we have a desire to meet that potential. And you'll see over here an example of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, kind of a graph of this. And so basically with the hierarchy of needs, it's the idea that your physiological needs down here at the bottom are the most important. You cannot really, according to Maslow, desire anything else if your physiological needs are not met. So if you don't have food to eat and water to drink, then it's hard for you to care about anything else. So you can see that these are down at the bottom. This is the foundation. But then if you do have your physiological needs met, you have air to breathe, and then we move up to your safety needs. And so we're motivated to be safe. And then we have our love and belongingness needs and our esteem needs. And someone who has had all of these met would actually then try to reach self-actualization. This is just the idea that you try to be the best version of yourself. It sounds very much like a late night infomercial, but you're just going to be the best version of you, right? So the humanistic perspective suggests that we are all inherently good people who are all striving to reach self-actualization, and that is what motivates us. So it stresses capacity for personal growth, freedom to choose our own destinies, positive qualities. You're a good person, but the problem is that sometimes, according to a humanistic perspective, things get in the way that make it hard for you to reach self-actualization. But that's more something to cover in theories of personality class, perhaps. But the humanistic perspective says you do what you do so you can become the best version of yourself that you possibly can be. All right, what about a social perspective? I don't know if you've taken social psychology. The social perspective here stresses the need for affiliation or relatedness. This is the idea that we do what we do in order to form and maintain healthy relationships. So we need warm, close, personal relationships. This is not necessarily romantic relationships, but you need some kind of sense of belonging with other people, having people that you can depend on and people who can depend on you. So a social perspective would say that most of our behaviors are motivated to help us have healthy, happy social relationships. Whatever the case may be, we can certainly draw a distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And this is actually where your last activity is going to come in. So extrinsic motivation means you are motivated by something outside of yourself. This is very much tied to the behavioral perspective of motivation, that you're doing something to get a reward or to avoid a punishment. So you may have some extrinsic reasons for going to college. You want to perhaps have your parents not nag you anymore, so you're avoiding a punishment. Or maybe you want to try to get a good job so you can make money, so you can buy things. That would be rewards that you're trying to get. On the other hand, sometimes we do things because we are intrinsically motivated. That means we are internally motivated even if we're not getting a reward. So maybe you decided to go to college because you really are passionate about whatever your major is, and you really care about it, and you want to learn about it, you enjoy learning. So you're not necessarily here to get the degree to make the money or to get your parents off your back. You're here because you genuinely want to be here. Now, if we're thinking back to the educational side of things, if possible, we would like our students to be intrinsically motivated. I asked myself the question, at what point do we stop learning because it's fun and start learning because we have to? And sometimes when I ask my students those questions, I get some really depressing answers, like school just wasn't fun after first grade, something like that. But we want to try to maintain intrinsic motivation. Of course, there's nothing wrong with extrinsic motivation. Sometimes that's all you have. You might not go to work if they didn't pay you. I can't say I blame you for that. But if we're talking about learning, an individual will be more successful, probably long term, less likely to quit when things become difficult, more likely to enjoy the process of learning if they are intrinsically motivated. So how can we help our students be intrinsically motivated to learn? That's actually part of your last activity. So activity 12 asks you to first of all examine your own interests. When it comes to the classes that you take, are you intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated? But then I'm also going to ask you to think from a teacher's perspective. Does it matter why a student is motivated? If the student does their homework and makes the grade, does it matter? How important is it for students to be intrinsically motivated? And how can we increase intrinsic motivation? One thing that was mentioned on this slide is that it could be personal choice. So a person is more likely to enjoy something if they feel like they have some freedoms. So if, for example, you let a student choose which book they want to write their book report about, or let a student choose which science experiment they want to engage in. If you let them choose something, they're more likely to be internally motivated. And then there are other ways too, helping the students see that even though things like grades and a good job are important, showing students that there is a real joy in learning, modeling that joy for students. Sometimes I think as a teacher we get bogged down and maybe we don't seem very joyful when we're teaching, and it makes you wonder, why would the students want to be there if the teacher doesn't want to be there? So modeling joy for your students, if at all possible, would be extremely helpful. So be thinking about your own motivation. Be thinking about, what do I do because I have to versus what do I do because I want to? And I think this also is tied into our mental health. I think we'll overall be happier, healthier individuals if we do have some things that we do just because we enjoy doing it. But it doesn't feel like our entire life has to be extrinsically motivated. So that's where I'm going to leave off lecture for today. We will finish the slides on motivation in our last lecture video. So you do have activity 12. Make sure to refer back to my announcement earlier about the fact that you do get 2 drop grades. You can use those as needed. But let me know if you have any questions about that. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys during the next lecture video.